Raquel Davis. I'm the Sultanate of Oman Chair and Associate Professor of Anthropology here in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Tonight's event is titled Decolonizing Knowledge Making on Iraq, and it's hosted by 3 Georgetown programs: Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, the Women's and Gender Studies at Georgetown University, and the Gender Plus Justice Initiative. And I'm going to now introduce our featured speaker, Zahra Ali. Most everyone in our class got the intellectual biography of you just a few minutes ago. Michael, raise your hand, Michael. Michael did your intellectual biography for our class. So thank you.
And Mike must read your book, by the way, too, this week. Yes.
So there's going to be a lot of engagement here. But for everyone else, I will give you her bio. So Zahra Ali is an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University-Newark. Her research explores the dynamics of women and gender, race and class, as well as social and political movements in relation to Islam, the Middle East, and the context of war and conflict, with a focus on contemporary Iraq. She is interested in racial capitalism, post-coloniality, decolonial and transnational feminisms, as well as critical knowledge production and epistemologies, especially in relation to global and political sociology. She currently leads Critical Studies of Iraq, an initiative aiming to foster support and develop the critical scholarship of social scientists and feminists based in Iraq. Dr. Ali works and writes in English, French, and Arabic, and is involved in feminist and critical knowledge production projects with activists and scholars from and in the Middle East and beyond. Dr. Ali will start with a presentation, and then we will open up the floor for audience participation. So raise your hand. She asked me to call on folks, and I will do that. And if you are online, please ask your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, and we will try to address as many questions as possible. Those of you online, if you have any technical issues, please email coco.tate@georgetown.edu, and that information will also be in the chat. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zahra Ali.
It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here and to come back, actually. I think last time I was here, probably in this room, was to talk about Thawra Tishrin, the October 2019 uprising. And it was, I think, like a few months after it started. So the energy was very electric in the room. I have a lot to talk about, so it's going to be a little long, but I want to cover a lot of things. And then, of course, you know, I'm happy to discuss everything. So thinking about decolonizing, decolonial knowledge making, decolonial theory is not something new. But I think that there is a lack of clarity on the relationship between postcolonial theory and scholarship and what is commonly called the decolonial term, especially in relation to the Arab world or the Middle East and North Africa. I have been writing about it more recently, and I want to start with acknowledging the fact that I have always been thinking collectively, in particular with feminists and scholars from the region. In the past years, I have been involved in a working group initiated by truly wonderful scholars and feminists, such as Laila Abu Lughat, Rabab al-Mahdi, Maysoon Sakkariya. And with a group of other wonderful scholars, we have been thinking about the notion of research ethics in relation to the last few decades of scholarship and knowledge making on the Middle East and North Africa. This is very much, I mean, what I'm going to present is very much the product of this reflection. I also worked with a French sociologist and political theorist, Sonia Dayan-Herzbrun, on a volume that will come out, it will come out in the fall, titled Decolonial Pluriversalism, and I'll talk about it a little bit at the end of the lecture. Working with her and thinking with the authors of the volume that it has really informed my thinking in the last few years. But also more importantly, and I will talk about it also in more detail later in this lecture, 2 years ago, I have launched with a group of Iraqi scholars and activists, the Critical Studies of Iraq initiative. And I have been working in Iraq with social scientists and feminist scholars, as well as activists on knowledge making. You notice that I'm not talking about knowledge production or avoiding the term production, and really emphasizing on the making of knowledge. and what it means to take Iraq as a framework and not as a case study, to theorize from and not about. The idea being to center epistemologies, research questions, and agendas as they emerge from activists and scholars in Iraq. And truly, the Critical Studies of Iraq initiative really came out of Thawrat Tashrin and the ways in which the October 2019 uprising in Iraq pushed us scholars, feminists, to expand our theoretical and political imagination. And I mean, I am actually preparing a manuscript on the topic titled Intifada, where I emphasize on the inti of the Intifada. And I take kind of a feminist approach of collectism. So this is just to say that my take on the work of decolonizing is a product of collective thinking, organizing and engaging with different academic and activist communities, feminists in particular. Ultimately, it is very much a work that is transnational, as is my personal, political, and academic journey. I also want to say that in this lecture, I will include in knowledge making both theory and research. I'm aware that there are specific debates related to theory and specific debate related to research, but I will try to kind of include both in this term knowledge making. But before I even start taking an analytical tone, that supposedly is the tone of academia, the hegemonic tone of academia is the tone of white masculinist rationality. Before I do that, I have to say that in a time of genocide, I refuse the distance, the disconnected, hegemonic, let's call it for what it is, academic bullshit. And that as we, feminists, have argued over and over again, emotions are the first window, the first form of analysis. And that right now, I truly struggle to be analytical. I really truly struggle to be articulate. Because what it feels right now is that there is so much to say, but at the same time, when it comes to Gaza, everything has been said, and that the situation is beyond words. Or should I say that only the words from the people of Gaza and Palestine really truly matter at the moment. There is so much analytical, political sciencey discussion, all this policy tone discussion, using terms such as negotiation, resolution. This is all just noise. We have all witnessed the shameless bankruptcy of academic institutions. We are seeing the coloniality of knowledge making in real time, the attacks, the bullying, the silencing, the censorship, and also what we are seeing, and perhaps what hurts the most, is all the silences, especially of those so sophisticated on everything else, right? The intersectional feminists, the decolonized this, decolonized that. We have seen the feminists and the scholars who are professionals in dissecting power structures make the most ridiculous all lives matter statement. We have all witnessed and experienced the bankruptcy, the corruption, the shameful failure of academic institutions and academics themselves. The academics who start their talks with indigenous land acknowledgement, how empty these statements are, how hypocritical. It is so easy to talk and to write after the massacre. I have seen feminists who have spent their careers critiquing the NGOization and humanitarianism not move a finger when the NGOs and the humanitarian organizations that they criticize have issued bold statements and, more importantly, offered their help, their concrete help to the people in Gaza. I think we should not forget this. Let's screenshot, Let's remind ourselves when we fall back into the habitus of the academy, let's remember this. Let's be done with the metaphorical decolonial agenda, the theoretical abstractions, the overly analytical that hides the self-invested, the egotistical, the cowardice of so many. Let's have no tolerance for this anymore. As a woman from Iraq, I have seen my country and my people being talked about as a thing that happens. People in this settler colony, that is the US, often say, Iraq happened, Afghanistan happened. Iraq, like Gaza, is talked about as the background of a conversation about something else. The something else being mostly US foreign policy. And the everyday life, the subjectivities, the experiences of the people living there is always missing. We have to be also careful with the terms that we use, because there's always a cover-up. When we use the term war, they say during the war, before the war, after the war, as if talking about equal adversaries. In 2003, the term war was hiding the term invasion and occupation. Today, in relation to Palestine, the term war is militantly and purposely used to hide the term genocide. The saturation of media propaganda campaign based on lies and misinformation, just like in the early 2000s, is here to hide the apocalyptic reality of Gaza today, the devastation, the incommensurable, the unspeakable tragedy. Because yes, in Iraq and in Gaza today, people have experienced the apocalypse, not only once, but time and time again. And words cannot contain the incommensurable reality of our losses. What are words, after all? Just sounds that contain little fragments of our feeling. It feels very much right now that only the poetic can actually express anything. Certainly not the academic language. This is a time of outrage, of action, of organizing at every level, of bearing witness, of amplifying the voices of people in Gaza, of Palestinians. As scholars, as feminists based here in this settler colony that is funding, arming, facilitating, and enabling Israel's genocidal war, there is a lot we can do, from supporting BDS in our campuses and places of work, to writing to our representatives, to protest, to sending money, to so many other things. But I think that the first thing we should absolutely continue doing is to listen to the people of Gaza and of Palestine, to the children of Gaza who are informing us about what is happening, and answer them through our intentions, through our actions, through our words, with all our hearts. It is one way to counter what the Palestinian feminist Wafa Hassan calls structural gaslighting. The structural gaslighting of corporate Western media and hegemonic political discourse will always center white tears, white suffering, and have us conflate the oppressed with the oppressors. Racism, white feminism, and homonationalism frame the hegemonic discourse. And when sometimes, and only as a result of Palestinians themselves taking charge of documenting and informing the world about what is happening, when sometimes the world do see victims, it can only see it through the lens of women and children. In Iraq during the invasion, and in Palestine today, and particularly in Gaza, men are not seen as victims. Men are seen as, by default, terrorist sympathizers. They are considered disposable. They are so easily erasable to be even mentioned. I think that one way actually to decolonize feminism, especially for white feminists based in Europe and in the US, is actually to put Arab men, Palestinian men, Iraqi men, Afghani men at the center of their political imagination as true feminist subjects. And yes, we should absolutely point out the massacres, because there is something specific when it comes to genocide, is that women and children are actually particularly targeted. and that for Zionists, nobody in Gaza is a civilian. In this context, where the people of Gaza have been abandoned, that they are alone are facing the genocidal Israeli ongoing settler colonialism, centering and amplifying their stories, their voices, their subjectivity, their everyday survival, their afterlives, their memories, mourning them, naming them, is the least we can do. As we say in Arabic, أضعف الإيمان. So what does decolonial and transnational feminism mean in terms of genocide? The trans, for me, is very important in transnational. It's a refusal of the international that essentialize and homogenize categories such as nation and women. To refuse, it signifies a refusal of the neoliberal, capitalist, white, middle-class woman of the world. It says that we live in one world structured by systems of power, such as racial, colonial, heteropatriarchal, capitalist, not structured by difference of culture, but the difference of systems of power, of how we position ourselves within these systems of power. That some, mostly but not strictly, in the global north benefit from these systems. And some are victims of it, oppressed by it. It means that some live at the expense, on the shoulder, through the exploitation and oppression of others. More clearly, it means that here in this settler colony in which we live, we need to insist on the relationship between racism, imperialism, and settler colonialism. We need to remind people that Gaza, Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, just like Vietnam, are present in the everyday life of people in this country, in its military-industrial complex, in its normalization of police violence, in anti-Black and anti-immigration racism, in its neo-colonial white feminism, in so many aspects of its social and economic and political life. I think that all the debates on racial reckoning have been very, very important in the past few years since the Black Lives Matter uprising. But I think that they also have to be articulated with imperial reckoning and the recognition that this country exists and thrives at the expense and through the destruction of other countries and their people. I am absolutely amazed by the solidarity movement for justice in Palestine, and that this movement is continuing despite it being 6 months. And I recognize the ways in which the movement is also the result of a coming together of different struggles. That the repertoire of activism used by indigenous people in the US, of the Black Lives Matter movement, is contributing to thinking and organizing around Palestine. As an Iraqi, I have learned so much from Palestinian mobilizing in Palestine and in the US and all over the world on how to build an agenda, a discourse, and narrative, how to create intersection with other movements for justice and freedom. It is very inspiring. At the same time, I also want to say something very important. The trans in transnational feminism, or maybe the D in decolonial, also mean challenging borders of nation, gender, and sexuality. And I want to say that I struggle, and I have struggled in the past 6 months and since ever, with simplistic anti-imperialist slogans and agenda. I want to think of a world where we humans are all truly connected and in which the integrity of the body, its freedom, its dignity of living a dignified life with all the structural and infrastructural dimension that it requires is at the center of our political and theoretical imagination. So that also means that our struggle for justice in Palestine refuses categorically to align itself with fascist regimes and political forces in the region. As an Iraqi, I know what authoritarianism is about, and I know too well how most Arab regimes have instrumentalized Palestine. The fascist political forces that are repressing and silencing movement for justice and freedom in Iraq and the region are not my allies. They are an essential part of the problem. I think it is important to recall that we also stand with the people of Iran, Iraq, Syria, not with the regimes that kill them and silence them, no matter what they pretend to represent, or no matter how they pretend to oppose. the US imperialism. So it is absolutely essential right now for us, feminists and people, scholars and students, to build spaces where we can collectively imagine the world we want to live in, not only the one that we are standing against. For that, it is essential to continue to put the experiences, the subjectivities, and the lives of those who are so easily erased and imprisoned in their precariousness, and to listen to the terms in which they are defining their oppressions, even when it does not fall into the way we frame or define the political, when it does not even fall into the categories that we already have. So those are like a few pictures of actually my book talk in Baghdad. When I presented my book, Women and Gender in Iraq, it was translated in Arabic, and I had like the presence of my family. There's my mother in the picture, and 4 of my aunties. Also the feminists that are the center of my book. And it was very important for me to also give back to the feminists that I worked with for over a decade. And I was very, pleased to also realize that the first person with whom I did my very first interview when I was a very, very clumsy and shy graduate student attended the event, and I had a lot of feedback, a lot of positive, a lot of negative. That's also the thing about giving back and being in conversation with the people that are at the heart of your research, is that you also are going to face criticism. But it was really a beautiful event. And so I want to keep those pictures behind me and take you with me kind of in another world, which is the world of US academia. So the personal is political. Once, while attending a major Middle East studies conference in the US, I tried to imagine how American studies as a field might look like outside of the US. What if the body of scholarship that defined and framed its theoretical debates was produced by scholars living in a country that had destroyed its higher education system and state infrastructures, and historically supported the repression of its intellectual class? I imagine major academic conferences being held in the country that had invaded and occupied the US. Wouldn't it be obvious that something was deeply wrong with American studies? Wouldn't it be necessary to question the political, epistemic, and ethical raison d'être of this field? Wouldn't it be essential to question the structural, infrastructural, and political injustices that led to the rise of a class of intellectuals and experts who define a field of study that excluded or at the expense of its so-called local scholars? During the same Middle East Studies conference, a group of scholars discussed the difficulty of accessing the field because of the ongoing security issues in Iraq. The conversation went on for a while as these scholars with faculty position attending a costly conference in a big American city continued to mention Iraq as an object. At no point during this discussion was there mention of the challenges faced by Iraqi academics and the structural inequalities between academics based in Iraq and those based in the US. It was assumed that there was something inherently good or useful about knowledge making on Iraq. I came across many scholars desperate to access the field. Many of these scholars, were critical of US military invasions and also saw themselves as on a mission to show the horrors of the war and imperialism. Nevertheless, they all were dealing with Iraq as a topic they would write about as part of their academic output and career interest in some American or European metropole. Their careers are based actually elsewhere than Iraq. Their research questions and the authors and theoretical debates with which they were engaging are also elsewhere. They almost never cited or engaged with the scholarship written in Iraq by Iraqi scholars. Their relationship to Iraq as a place, its everyday realities, its people, its scholars even, had a transactional feel, in the sense that the field and the theories drawn from it were used to develop an agenda for other Iraq experts. And of course, when it comes to Middle East studies, I mean, we can talk about language too. How come that, like, you don't see somebody in French studies, for example, who doesn't speak French? Why is that? It is so common in Middle East studies that a person who studies Iraq or Egypt or Iran doesn't speak Arabic or Farsi. Why is that it is so common and tolerable? I know language is a complex topic and we don't resolve everything through language, but I think it is indicative of something. What was most troubling was that they appeared to have no accountability or obligation to Iraqi research institutions and scholars. If they have done some sort of fieldwork, they can decide how and on what terms they relate to the field, including whether or not to stay in touch with the interviewees. They can also decide to switch to some other region or place if and when they want to. A scholar based in the US or in Europe can freely decide to study and write on Iraq. At no point in their entire career, whether when they are applying for a grant or getting an academic position, will these scholars be required to demonstrate the relevance of their research question and findings to those they are researching. The IRB, the Institutional Review Board, mandated to deal with ethical, so-called ethical concerns in protecting human subjects, do not ask the fundamental questions posed by the great feminist Linda Toohey White-Smith in her book, Decolonizing Methodologies. Whose research is it? Who owns it? Whose interest does it serve? Who will benefit from it? Debates on the relationship between knowledge-making, space, place, and positionality have enriched our understanding of how to do so-called ethical research. Feminist and postcolonial, decolonial scholars have asked crucial questions about the political economy and geopolitics of doing research and making knowledge. The importance of this question takes on special force in the context of Iraq. When we consider the role the US and the UK played in dismantling the Iraqi higher education system through sanctions and wars, and the way in which scholarship on the Middle East produced there has been weaponized to justify military intervention. The structural inequalities that exist between scholars based in Iraq and those based in the global north are the product of empire and decades of military and intelligence intervention. There can be no innocent knowledge produced on Iraq because of this history of destruction, military intervention, and occupation. My kind of intervention in the idea of decolonizing knowledge making is really to focus on the material, structural, and infrastructural dimension of knowledge making on Iraq today. To uncover some of the key conditions that have led to Iraq being researched and theorized outside of its borders, including the systematic inequalities existing between scholars based in the US and in European universities and Iraqi scholars based in Iraq. I also want to suggest, and towards the end, and I'll suggest an alternative research imaginary that politicizes research ethics by putting justice and equality over this obsession with research and knowledge making. Those are pictures of our martyrs, our shuhada, individuals that were killed during the October 2019 uprising. So global means unequal. The great feminist Amina Mama, in her reflection on research and knowledge making on the African continent, entitled, "Is it ethical to study Africa?" states eloquently it is in a context of profound global and systemic inequality that it seems fair to question whether studying Africa is in fact an ethical thing to do, and to consider the implications of our identities, location, and institutional affiliations, as well as the epistemological and methodological constraints and choices that inform such studies. What does our research and knowledge contribute to the various contexts and people we study? How do our research activities affect those we study? Can we develop the study of Africa so that it is more respectful toward the lives and struggles of African people and to the agendas, studies that contribute to the good of Africa? End of quote. Mama does not limit herself to a critique of the structures of power that are central to the global academy. She also points out the relationship between scholars, their careers, and academic choices, and the political economy of global knowledge production. As critical feminist scholarship has shown, it is not only about what knowledge is being produced, but who produces it, who does the research, and according to what agenda. Mama shows that what is often dismissed as identity politics, and there's so much dismissal of identity politics, is in fact political, economic, and structural. I know that it would be the academically correct thing to say that we should privilege politics of resistance to politics of identity. That's kind of a common statement. But I think that the ways in which identity is often dismissed, especially for us working in and on the Arab world and the Middle East, and I think that on this, actually, we should really take inspiration from Black studies and the way it handles this debate. I think that this dismissal of identity politics really hides the fact that focusing on the who reveals the system of power that produce, in that case, the social status and the social, political, economic, structural, and infrastructural conditions of possibility of this who to exist in the first place. So when making knowledge and writing, in what way do we participate in the current capitalist academic machine? What are the consequences of our obsession with, as Rabab al-Mahdi asked us in relation to Middle East political sciences, our obsession with making the powerful arguments. When you review a paper, it's all about making the powerful argument. Mama also asked us to consider the impact of the research on those who are researched. I could talk for hours about what the US did in Iraq, but I will limit myself to say that the US administration played a crucial role in destroying Iraq's education system, universities, and research institutions. By calling for the UN sanctions that destroyed Iraqi state institutions and infrastructures, its numerous military interventions since the 90s, even before, and its devastating invasion in 2003 and later occupation have led to the true dismantling of Iraqi public universities. Going back to at least the 60s, the US actively supported the repression of democratic forces in Iraq, including thinkers and scholars who played a central role in Iraq's cultural and intellectual life. As a result of the sectarian war that followed the invasion and occupation, Iraqi intellectuals and university professors were targeted by armed groups and systematically assassinated, threatened, or forced to exile. So on the one hand, the mechanism of US academic hegemony dominates and frames what is being researched and theorized in Iraq and what counts as proper knowledge, right? Undermining the credibility and visibility of the scholarship made in Iraq. On the other hand, the US has destroyed the very possibility of a robust academic life in Iraq, both materially by provoking a collapse of state institutions and plunging the country into cycles of armed violence, and intellectually by sustaining a context in which a free intellectual life in Iraq is currently impossible. The political forces brought to power by the US-led invasion have systematically attacked the Iraqi public universities, depriving them of any support while privatizing the Iraqi education system. Moreover, specific, and in the past few years, we've seen so much of it, specific legal mechanisms have been put in place that limit freedom of expression in the name of the war on terror. As pointed out in so many statements signed by hundreds and thousands of intellectuals, journalists, judges, and activists in Iraq, the post-2003 Iraqi political establishment has intensified its repression of any form of political dissent. It has reactivated the Ba'ath regime's law sanctioning freedom of expression and organized and voted in new laws that allow the state to repress the political opposition. Iraqi scholars are facing structural, infrastructural, and political challenges that really severely limit their ability to do research and make substantial knowledge. And I can talk, if you want, in the Q&A about the banning of the term gender. Since about a year, we have been through a huge propaganda. I mean, basically the political forces that are allied to Iran, that were supported by the US military during the invasion of Daesh, have launched an incredibly intense anti-gender campaign. And now using the term gender is bad, which really, in relation to the work that I will mention later, makes it really, creates impossibilities. And of course, there's always ways around censorship, but it's to just give you a sense of the freedom of speech and intellectual, the dynamism of intellectual life in Iraq today. So, whose knowledge? As a sociologist of Iraqi descent, based in the US and doing research on and in Iraq, I'm often contacted by scholars and research students asking me to help them connect them to the field. Even when applying for a job, actually, I remember being told by a potential employer at a Middle East Studies Research Center that hiring me would be good for the graduate students who are looking for someone to connect them to the field. In other words, I am sometimes seen as a native informant and a person with an inside connection. My connection to the field work as a kind of a currency in the academic job market. I refuse such role. Actually, when research students approach me with a project on Iraq, I ask them to reflect on their positionality and their agenda. I ask them if they feel that they are the best person to do this research. I ask them how their research might be beneficial to the people they are going to spend time with. This does not mean that I do not think that US or Europe-based researchers or doctoral students should not study Iraq. It's not what I'm saying. However, I do not want to be a facilitator for an agenda that does not begin with ethical questions about the structural inequality, political questions about the structural inequalities between privileged researchers with resources and a field where scholars are less resourced and work under different conditions, including being part of a population deeply affected by the policies of the governments and countries largely responsible for these inequalities. The problem is structural and systemic. And this is an argument, we've heard it a lot as feminists when we talk about sexism and heteropatriarchy, and when we complain about colleagues or our bosses. It's structural, it's systemic. It's not about people. Yet, individuals are part of these structures and systems. I will just provide one example. After a conference in an established East Coast university, I was approached by a master's student who had spent substantial time in the south of Iraq, actually in the city of my mother, in Najaf. He told me about the amazing time he spent with religious people, as he called them, and how they welcomed him and so generously opened their houses to him, offered him dinner and lunches. And he wanted to do ethnographic work on, very original, on religious identities in Iraq. When I asked him, what brought you to the south of Iraq in the first place? He answered, oh, I was working for an oil company. Whatever his intention or political views, this student stands on the privileged side of a political economy of knowledge production, situated within a global economy in which Iraq is the field from which both oil and research data are extracted. I thought about his freedom to come and go as he pleased, with no accountability, no requirement of giving anything back. while none of the families that had generously hosted him would ever get a visa to come visit him for years. Even when it comes to making knowledge about popular and grassroots movements, such as the recent uprisings in Iraq and the region, one notes, and there's a lot of study, and I can give you references after if you want, the majority of articles on uprisings in the region are produced in English and outside of the Arab world by US foreign policy experts from elite universities. They do not cite scholars in the region unless they use them as native informants. They engage with one another's arguments, mostly political scientists. They write for think tanks whose primary goals are to understand the costs and benefits of US foreign policies in the region. Most of the authors and those they cite are white male American or US-based scholars whose focus, how original, is on democratization, regime change, and Islamism. One could argue that it is only fair that scholars based in the US are American-centered, and that the research questions or problem space, as David Scott puts it, of a US-based scholar would be different from the theoretical frame of Iraqi scholars based in Iraq. This would be acceptable if indeed the scholarship in Iraq was developing independently and on equal terms with the scholarship in the US. Global academia or global knowledge production tends to be equated with scholarship published in English and in academic journals based in the US and Europe that defines the dominant understanding of what academic research and knowledge making should be. To have any visibility, any importance, any relevance, scholars in Iraq must and are required to engage with research questions developed in the US and EU. The point here is not to stigmatize US-based knowledge in itself. I think that there is no perfect positionality to do anything. There is no authentic knowledge, authentic people, authentic positionalities. There are power relations and hierarchies, even when scholars are from the place, right? There are class, gender, structural dimensions, and limits to any form of knowledge making. The idea is really to acknowledge that research agendas and the theories that emerge from them are embedded in a world of deep inequalities. And in this case, also direct violence. The problem is that some systematically benefit from these inequalities. The ways the field of Iraq is approached in places like the US and Europe only reproduces rather than challenges this structural unevenness. So let's try to reimagine knowledge making. Imagining alternative research futures starts with questioning the disengagement, and I really think more than about people or their identity, it is about the way we engage. So it's about questioning the disengagement of social science research and political science, let's not even talk about it, from its context, the distance between research agendas and those who are researched, and the imposition of an agenda that serves interest and profit that depend on reproducing a system of inequalities and violence. As a young sociologist and feminist from Iraq, educated in France, you can probably hear it in my accent, and is now working in a US university, I'm fully aware of the transnational dimension of knowledge making. And I do not argue for the creation of academic borders or that there is such a thing, as I said, as a perfect positionality or authentic knowledge. What I argue is that the structural dimensions of the condition of possibility of research and its circulation need to be addressed. I would like to see my research and that of others benefit those who are researched. I would like to see those who are being researched in charge of their own agenda, and to have the material, social, and political conditions that would allow them to decide which questions are important and which ones are not. And I know that these questions are not specific to Iraq or to the Middle East. You can apply them to so many other contexts and places. So let us imagine that research institutions in Iraq had resources to develop an independent academic agenda. For that, we have to imagine that Iraq's higher education system is robust and that there is academic freedom and freedom of expression, that the political system put in place by the US invasion and occupation in 2003 did not plunge the country into cycles of violence and militarization that put at risk anyone who speaks out against the political parties and armed group in power. That Iraqis' everyday life was not structured by violence, and that the military oil capitalist complex that has been sustained by US imperialism has ended. Let's imagine that Iraqis are living in a sovereign country with strong and functioning public infrastructures and services. So we see that the imagination of a different kind of knowledge making lead us to imagine a different world. Then Iraqi scholars and research students would be able to publish papers that would be widely read and could have an impact in global academia, because considered of equal weight and importance as papers published in the UK or US academic journal. For that to happen, we need to radically reimagine the current state of global academia. Could it be that what is valued in research is what is directly useful to those who are researched, and what has been emancipated from agendas based on profit and imperial political hegemony? And I think that there's a lot of debate, within feminist scholarship about translation politics, who you translate, who you decide to translate and make accessible, and also about citation politics. I think these debates are very important, but I also think that it is too simplistic to think that once we start quoting people from people of color or people from the global south, things are actually going to change. Or once we just translate the work and people could see that actually there's meaningful knowledge that is being produced, that it will actually address the core of the issue. I think that what we need is actually a more radical agenda, a deeper engagement. And of course, this engagement is not easy. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of time. It also means that we work differently. So yes, we need to politicize research ethics, and as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang argue, the work of decolonizing is not a metaphor, but demands that we question and challenge the world as we know it. In the meantime that we obtain the world that we want, as we work to dismantle the structural conditions of research on Iraq and the Middle East more broadly, there are a lot of concrete things that we can do. One very concrete thing would be to direct resources towards supporting Iraqi research institutions and scholars and institutions in the global south, so that an organic and independent research agenda might emerge from there. This is not a matter of making US-based Iraqi studies more diverse. It is not a matter of diversity. By including more scholars from Iraq in US-based conferences and publications. Again, what we need is something else, something much more radical. US-based scholarship needs to not only be provincialized and located, but also recognized for what it is, a scholarship emerging from a global imperial power that has played a central role in dismantling the very possibility of scholarship in Iraq. Very importantly, it may also mean challenging the ways we define what counts as knowledge and what is considered theoretical and what is not. We need to break with the dominance of a form of academic knowledge that has privileged a certain style of writing, one tied to a specific rationality that, as many social scientists have argued, is linked to a certain class position. Writings from the Middle East are often criticized for their supposed lack of theoretical framework. They're not robust academic writing, and scholars in universities based in the region are sometimes faulted for reproducing the hegemony of Western theories as well. Others fault scholars writing in Arabic for tending to rely on media sources, first-hand accounts and interviews in their citation, rather than on proper academic books and articles. However, it must be recognized that actually Arabic writings from the region always tend to put social justice concerns over geopolitics and strategic issues. There's a lot of issues and problematic related to writings in Arabic, but the primary concern is not US foreign policy in these writings. Instead of considering Arabic writings as less academic, we could redefine both the form and content of academic writing. After all, scholars in Iraq are experiencing the realities about which scholars in the US are theorizing. The emotional, personal, and material attachments and direct engagement with their context should produce different research questions and an alternative academic agenda from which we have much to learn. In partnership with scholars and activists based in Iraq, I'm currently invested in the Critical Studies of Iraq initiative that direct resources and funding to Iraq scholars and research institutions and aim at developing an independent research agendas. As opposed to knowledge making on Iraq, the initiative fosters theorizing in and from Iraq. And of course, Iraq as a place where people live, not Iraq as necessarily a nation state. It's not about essentializing Iraq as a nation state, but it is looking at it as a place where people live. Support also the development of scholarship that is meaningful for people in Iraq to sustain critical thinking, social justice. I argue that taking Iraq as a framework and centering the subjectivities of its scholars is essential to dismantle the systems of power knowledge that structures global academia today. The idea is also to promote this scholarship, to give it visibility, to make it circulate as well. Last May, we organized a conference. I mean, those are some of the pictures of the conference we organized in Baghdad, gathering feminists and social scientists from all over the country, actually. Then we asked ourselves questions. I mean, there were two premises of the conference, and it was really the subject of a lot of debates and discussion. But the first premise was that we do not treat as entirely separate social theory from feminist theory. That was an important point. And that we do not treat as distinct the knowledge made by academics who have a position in Iraqi universities. We had a lot of deans of social science schools and sociologists and anthropologists based at Iraq's main universities. But we decided not to treat as distinct their knowledge making and the knowledge making of activists and other type of intellectual. And we asked the following questions. What are the epistemological questions that are meaningful for scholars in Iraq? What kind of research agendas are needed? What are the important questions and challenges, for example, that a professor at the University of Baghdad or Al-Basra that would want to work on beyond those dictated by international or local policymakers? How can scholars and scholar activists in the very limited spaces of freedom and given the infrastructural collapse make meaningful knowledge to address their realities? But also at the same time, how do we make knowledge that is not entirely conditioned by these realities? Many Iraqi scholars actually during the conference expressed their frustration with the constant necessity to catch up with the academic productive machine. It is brutal to be asked to be up to date with the knowledge produced in the West on Iraq. This knowledge becomes authoritative, even when it's available only in English, actually. And scholars in Iraq are told to cite this scholarship and engage with it constantly. So the critical studies of Iraq is a result of, for me, more than a decade of deep engagement and work with mostly feminist scholars and activists and social scientists in Iraq. I did not just decide to launch the initiative. It came organically after working with people and engaging with them. It came as a result of connections really built through my relation. And I think it's important to say that after all, identity is relation, right? It is the relation, the meetings, the encounters that you make along the way that are going to define also who you are and how you work. These scholars, these activists are not a field from me. They are part of my transnational intellectual community, and I am accountable to them. What I like and what I find refreshing about the work that we are doing is that it is not interested in being overly theoretical and jargonistic. It is not obsessed with finding the new theory. But on the contrary, it places people's everyday concerns and needs and the necessity to bridge the gap between people and intellectuals. It is a challenging project, and we have faced the dilemma of, on the one hand, we want to put Iraqi scholars on the map, right? And so then we want to end up with papers that can be recognizable as proper academic papers, and that could be published in academic journals. And at the same time, we also recognize that most theory in Iraq is actually not to be found in academics or intellectual texts. Most theory is made in the words of poets. In a country where almost everyone is a self-declared poet, almost everyone. The really theorizing, I mean, what does theorizing mean? It means to make sense of, right? So making sense of the everyday and the world is through poetry. So what we are thinking and debating, about ways to honor that and promote poetry as a theoretical form, as a central form of knowledge making. Also, when teaching and workshopping with a group of scholars, we are careful to refuse what we call any canon, what we call any marja'iyya, and to provincialize the authors, the text, because there is a tendency, and I have seen it in the region, I've seen a lot of it in the region emerging, there's a tendency to reject sometimes in a very reactionary and dogmatic way the work of white scholars, and then to almost impose as a new canon the work of postcolonial or decolonial scholars. This does not make sense to me. And concretely, it does not make sense when you actually do the work of decolonizing knowledge. I think it is as problematic as the rest. So I haven't really truly defined the term decolonizing here. And I think it would be actually unproductive to distinguish too strictly between what is commonly called postcolonial and decolonial theoretical approaches or knowledge making. Scholarship that uses these terms or are associated with them often share a critique of Eurocentrism and colonialism. These critiques of colonialism rely heavily on, postcolonialism really relied heavily on critical epistemologies developed in post-war Europe and speak to its historical and intellectual context. Postcolonial thinking first developed in the field of the humanities, and as a result focused very much on the discursive dimension of Western hegemony. It was then used in the scholarly fields of social sciences and political theory to reflect on the very material realities of colonial modernity, echoing what is now commonly called critical race theory as well in the US. While some have found in post-structuralist, postmodern theories the tool with which to question political and epistemic violence, others, notably decolonial theorists, have chosen other references as points of departure. While most postcolonial works assert the beginning of the process of capitalist colonial modernity in the 19th century, and it's really the case when talking about the Middle East, this is usually the colonial theories considered 1492 to be a key term. For them, 1492 is not the central date because of the so-called discovery of the Americas, but because it marks the beginning of colonization of the world by European imperial forces, starting with the reconquest of Muslim Spain. This colonization of the world by European empires initiated a process of exploitation and slavery of colonized people through a racialization of the world. In that sense, decolonizing is to look at the indigenous peoples that are still here and to uncover the centuries of political and epistemic violence, past and present, that conspire to silence and hide their existence. Decolonizing is to call modernity by its name, colonial, patriarchal, and capitalist. It is to consider the Anthropocene and the planetary and to privilege perspectives that help us not only make sense of, but also develop ways of thinking and living which challenge the very destruction of life in all its form provoked by capitalist modernity. It is not to dogmatically reject the European canon or to essentialize indigenous knowledge, but it is very much to creolize it. And my own thinking was very influenced by the work of Edouard Glissant. Creolizing the canon is to provincialize European scholarship and place it equally among others. It is also putting people, ideas, and ways of being in relation, and to let the transformations that occur as a result of this encounter develop in ways that are multi-directional, unpredictable, as Edouard Glissant says, poetic. A pluriversal approach, which is something that I talk about in the forthcoming book, suggests multiple ways of existing, speaking, writing, making knowledge, and creating aesthetic forms. It means situating and historicizing these forms in the context of the power relation, processes, and genealogies that condition them and make them possible. My choice of the term decolonizing is driven by the need to go further than a critique, right? And what I identify as the work of decolonizing refers to a series of efforts that do not revolve around only the critique of Western and regional also hegemonies, but rather offer alternative epistemologies. I will conclude with using the definition of one of the authors of this book. His name, he's an artist, he's a poet actually, he's not an academic, Olivier Marbeuf, who defined decolonizing in a way that really, I mean, it really echoes my own thinking, because it speaks to the coming and going between refusing the reality of the world we live in, right? And fighting its violent and cruel systems of power, but still live in them, as opposed to be stuck in a reactionary refusal of reality, right? While imagining and building alternative futures. So this is his definition. It is being present while negotiating an escape. It is a contradictory movement of entering and escaping into a world that is singular, as there is no other world, only alliances and distances. Thank you so much.
Questions? You're gonna
Yes, you're gonna.
Okay. Give you chair here.
Oh, should I sit here?
No, you're fine. I think if you sit a little bit here, then everyone can see you a little bit better if you don't mind. Yeah. Have a drink of water. This will give Alex a little time to prepare his question. Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. That was amazing. There's so much to think about. I know everybody's heads are like, if your heads are all, whoa, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you for being with us. I just had a question on two things you said. You said you want research to be more beneficial and can be employed by the person that is being researched. And linked to that, I like your thought earlier about how when we talk about Gaza, how there's an overemphasis on women and children, and that the Arab man is left aside, and that you were suggesting the use of feminist theory to understand the role of the Arab man, and I was curious in understanding that a bit more. So if you could tell us a bit more about the frameworks that you were looking at, or how that would come across in more theoretical and practical terms, that'd be really interesting.
Okay, I like the question. Thank you. I'll take a few maybe so that I can.
Whatever you would like. Yep. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking. It's a lot to think about. So in terms of my question, you talked about the role of capital in academia. Both the examples of, like, for example, the person who was in Iraq, or all the places when we see the capital connection. But recently, with what's going on in Palestine and Gaza, we saw numerous donors who threatened academia and institutions directly. So I was wondering if you thought about that and how that applies in the theoretical sense, about the intersection between capital and academic, not only frameworks, but incentives, disincentives, and how we maybe as future scholars would need to think about that.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you so much. And my question is specifically about deploying the poetic in knowledge making. And you talked about it so beautifully all throughout your talk. So thank you for that, because it's not usually brought to light. And as you said, there's more theorizing, intellectualizing, and especially in times like this where we're seeing genocide happen and we're supposed to come up with all these ideas about it, when in reality, we maybe should be looking at the emotional experience and the bodily experience of witnessing that. So
Yeah.
You have more questions. Do you want to pause? Or do you want...
Yeah, maybe I'll say a few things.
So I have Ali Shifa and then Shannon.
So let me start with my emphasis on the poetic. I mean, 6 months ago, I couldn't even, and I'm sure many of us in this room couldn't even, I even found any analytical tone insulting. Like anybody, like on social media, for example, like analyzing the superstructure of capital and Gaza. It's like what is this? and I think that we tend to not talk about, I think feminists do it. They are the only ones who do it. I mean, really, we have to emphasize on the importance of radical feminist intervention in what is knowledge making today, and even its influence on the academy. I mean, we tend to forget about the brutality of this form of rationality, of which is predominantly the white masculine rationality, where something happened and you are supposed to engage with it in a distant, so-called objective, we know objectivity doesn't exist, but way. And I think that the whole discourse on the Middle East is that kind of discourse. It is a caricature of that kind of discourse. We know that, I mean, the Middle East is mostly studied through the lens of political sciences. I mean, we have good historians, we have a few social scientists, actually very few sociologists, good anthropologists, that's not a lot, but good anthropologists. But this lens of political science, this lens of analyzing a human experience, a massacre, a tragedy, loss that are incommensurable, unspeakable, through like a few lines of analysis is for me insulting. And actually, I actually refuse it. Maybe, you can disagree with me, but for me, I could not even write anything. Like even the act of sitting and writing for me was impossible. I was like, no, I should keep my energy to organize. I should keep my energy and my time. Time and energy are resources that are limited in one's lifetime. And I should just organize, go to the streets, put stickers everywhere, Free Palestine stickers everywhere. I mean, others, and I respect that, have written, and in powerful ways. And I think that anything that could be useful for students to make sense, I mean, there has been a good writings, right? But the only writing that I was capable of doing is actually, so Rania Jawad, who is the head of the Women's Institute at Birzeit University, she launched this wonderful project called Women's Testimonies of Gaza. And she connected directly through WhatsApp, through people she knows, with actually women in Gaza. And they posted things on social media, or they sent testimonies to her through WhatsApp voice messages about what they were going through. And so the only thing that I found meaningful as a person, as a woman, as a feminist, is actually to not let these words be unanswered. And so with a few other feminists, and I really thank Rania for giving me this opportunity, the only thing that I was really capable to do is actually to write to one of the women who wrote something that really, that I found powerful, that echoed so much inside of me, and just be in conversation with her and try to help her too. I mean, that's also the thing, is that once things become academic, so it is an academic institution, Birzeit University, there's like issues of funding and things like that. And what Rania Jawad did, that I really found very powerful, is that what she wanted to do is not to start a new archives project, right? Archives of an ongoing genocide. That would be a very like wonderful academic title, but is to actually try to build community with the woman. So people are in the middle of this tragedy, these massacres, and sitting with them is not
I mean, it is not even, it is the most politically incorrect thing to say, okay, what do you think right now? How do you feel? And let me archive it. And no, it's really about being in conversation with these women and trying to help them, trying to help some of them to get out of Gaza, try. And I do think that it's meaningful also to be in conversation, even when we feel actually that we are helpless. And it's funny how much, like, despite the fact that I mean, many of us live here, have lived here many years, this feeling of helplessness is kind of crazy when you think about it, when there is so much resources and there is a certain, level of academic freedom and of freedom in general. I mean, there's always something you can do. It reminds me of actually, maybe you're familiar with Alaa Abdel Fattah, the Egyptian activist who has been imprisoned since so many years under Sisi. And there, in this book that was published with a lot of the words that in the text that he actually published that he wrote while in an Egyptian prison, he was saying, stop saying that Egypt is a big prison, because I am in prison and I know what prison is. There are always things to do. And of course, we have to be strategic, we have to be smart, of course. But I think that, for me personally, just writing to this woman, being in conversation with her, letting her know that I see that I'm not looking away, that a lot of people care about her and about everyone in Gaza, was the only intervention that I was capable of doing. And I'm still actually, it's still a struggle to be really analytical and talk about power structures. I mean, I've done it in relation to Iraq. I've been doing it in the past decade, but right now in relation to Gaza, it's something that I pretty much refuse to do. And definitely, I think that the academic language is not the language through which we should process what is happening. And a lot of us have been turning to poetry. Maybe it's because only poetry actually makes sense. Only poetry allows us to be emotional and to exist, basically. Through the words of a poet, things are like evoked. There's imaginaries that are developed that cannot be developed through rationality, right? And it's interesting actually, because when you look at Iraqi literature since 2003, most of the literature is actually magic realism. And and I remember Shahad Al-Rawi, actually, through the project, we invited her to give a talk, and she answered to one of the students was asking her, like, why is that in your book? So she's a young Iraqi writer who wrote a wonderful novel translated in English called The Baghdad Clock. And one of my students actually said, of the student, it was somebody else's student, said, why is that we don't see the difference between like reality and imagination in your novels? And she said that, it wasn't necessarily escapism, but that as people, we spend most of our life either sleeping or in imagining things in our head. So why is that we should distinguish between the real world and the imaginary world? But I do think that in the case of Al-Iraq, in the cases of what is happening in Gaza, the poetic imagination can keep us going. So I'll, on issues of actually capitalism and research, so you can check out the work of Maysoon Sukkariya. It's such a powerful work. She actually, there's this article that she wrote with somebody else, I forgot the name, but I think the terms in the title is research extractivism. And she wrote a lot about the ways in which certain networks of like research institution in Europe and in the US connected to certain centers in the Middle East, in particular in Lebanon, were sending like for decades students one after the other to Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, right? And so she described in this article how, so the networks exist. So you have like graduate students who arrive and like, I want to study the Middle East, and they are sent because these networks, I mean, are related to a political economy, related to the way academia is funded, etc. And also a lot of actually the centers in the region, I mean, rely on sources of funding that have requirements and that are also tied to universities outside that have their own agenda as well. So you send students, and so this local research center gets benefits or gets visibility because it's welcoming international students. And then automatically they send the student to the same refugee camp that ask the same question to the same refugees who feel that they are obliged to answer, because maybe if they don't answer, somebody will cut aid from them, or maybe they will benefit from answering, right? So I mean, she put it in such an intelligent way in this article, and she really portrays it so well. So I think we really need to ask ourselves those questions. And I mean, for me, it's so obvious when it comes to Iraq. It's so obvious when it comes to Gaza too. And I'm actually like already I've seen people publishing things, and when really the thing to do is to just voice. It's all already there, right? And I mean, people in Gaza, I've realized that most of the information I'm getting from Gaza, it's probably the case for you all, it's from children, right? It's from children, actually. I mean, for example, Bisan Ode, she's a child, right? She's 17. And so you realize that people are taking charge of the information that they want to get out, the discourse that they want to use, and how they want to represent and portray themselves. They don't need anybody to like do a research or write a book or whatever, or an article. I mean, I think that right now, amplifying the voices exist. Making them circulate is really the best way to actually counter this research extractivism that is so dominant when it comes to the region. And so the women and children, and so this is for me a very important intervention in feminist theory. And I'm not the only one who says that. You can check out the work of Jasbir Puar, for example, of other scholars. And I think that it is looking at feminism. I mean, already critical feminist theory has questioned the woman as a feminist subject, right? Questioning the fact that woman is a homogeneous category. I mean, there's intersectional feminism. There's a lot on that, but I think that recognizing that some humans have never been granted the status of human, and so giving them a centrality in our thinking, in our theoretical and political imagination, as people, as scholars, as feminists, really shift what then the feminist politics are going to look like, right? Then it is, I mean, I actually remember I gave a talk once at a very prestigious place that I will not name. But, and I remember when I was talking about Thawrat Tishrin, about the October 2019 uprising, most of the pictures of the shuhada, the martyrs, are young men. They were in the front line, poor, actually, young men from the poorest neighborhoods of Baghdad and of Iraq. And so I was showing these pictures and giving this kind of critical feminist reading of the uprising. And the first question that I had from the audience, from honestly, an older white lady, was, "But I don't understand why you show us all these pictures of men. Where are the women?" And this is something that we hear so much when it comes to our region. It's like by default, she was also considering that I was dismissing women, right? And that there is nothing feminist about showing men as martyrs, right? And the whole kind of theoretical frame that I want to push here is actually that it is the absolute feminist thing to do that.
A lot of questions. So I had, sorry, I made a list so that I won't forget. Now I found my list. It was Shifa and Ali and Shano. And then Iqlil had her hand up, and there's a question from online.
Okay.
Thank you for reminding me.
First of all, thank you for being here today. It was beautiful listening to you speak. Honestly, you speak very beautifully.
Thank you.
Outside of like the force that comes with what you were saying. My question is about your conversation on identity politics. You mentioned that identity is relations, defining who you are and how you work, and also that there isn't really I think it's equally difficult to write about something that's close to you, than it is to write something about something that's sort of far away, but for different reasons, obviously. So I wonder how you navigated that, as you wrote about, but also coming from obviously being Western educated and realizing that there's a power dynamic at play there. Like, how do you navigate these issues, both personally, if you don't mind answering it, personally and academically, like as you write and as you hear back from academics and the people we've interviewed alike, I guess, the people we interact with.
Thank you again. You said this word, the academic habitus, and I find it interesting. And I think since the 7th of October and everything happening in Palestine, it got exposed to us that the academic habitus is uncomfortable with the material questions of decolonization. And without getting into trouble, it's just the material questions of decolonization. And this seems to be a shock that people actually act on their needs and their beliefs. How can do you see the academic habits changing or challenging themselves or challenging the comfort zone?
So my question is basically two parts, if you don't mind. For first one is similar to Shifa's question about navigation. How do you navigate, but in two different ways? How do you navigate personally with your personal involvement? From the first piece I read for you, immediately I felt the personal approach. How do you navigate that personal involvement, which is very central and valuable in the production, like you mentioned, or making of the knowledge? Which can make you struggle sitting and writing, and how do you navigate in the field where the scholars can be mostly from outside the region itself? That's about navigation. My other question is about decolonization and how do we do decolonization in the right way? Because ever since I was exposed to study of Middle Eastern in the United States, I feel like it's too focused on decolonization, which is important. But what kind of decolonization is more important to me? Because sometimes I can feel like from reading for some scholars how this decolonization can be not benefiting those we are writing about, like you mentioned, because we can overlook certain things that are real, but do fall under stigma and stereotypes. Concern to avoid stigma and stereotypes in the region can make us decolonize or over-decolonize in a way that we actually overlook. For example, whenever I read some articles written about our region, I would share with people in Iraq. And I would say, can you relate? Like, if you are a scholar or in academia, how do you feel about being taught and written about you in this way? And sometimes it is not the right way of decolonization. So how do you navigate that? Especially because your approach, and I want to just close with that, admiring your approach because you have this intersectionality and multitude that is combining all the sense, like lenses of feminism and poetry and appreciation for sentimentality that are not encouraged in the academic field. Thank you for that approach.
Thank you so much. Is there more?
Person online's question has been asked, so I think we covered that one. And there's, if you had one,
yes,
you want to.
I've really appreciated everything that you've said and the ways that you've articulated yourself today. And I want to ask, well, two questions. The first is, how would you recommend that we negotiate between being taken seriously in the world of academia while also pushing for creating these alternative and like more accessible ways of engaging with knowledge making? The second is more about your own experience. In what ways would you say that organizing has been for you a way to be responsible to or accountable to the people that you research? Thank you.
Thank you. The quick question is, do I see, so the academic habitus question, is there change? I mean, I don't know. Maybe time will tell. I think there is, to a certain extent. I mean, I'm familiar with French academia, and I'm telling you, it's way worse than here. I mean, Germany, France, it's like, forget about it, forget about it. And I mean, if there's change, it's like on the, like, the right wing is like moving very, very fast. I think there is change. I mean, I have felt like this time, the opening of certain conversations that I honestly never thought we would have, like, in decades. I really thought that this will always be the red line, that the fear of Zionist attack is always like over our head throughout all of our careers, whatever we do. And I feel that there's an opening here. And so I think that, especially, I mean, the younger generation, there are things that now become obvious that I didn't know that people actually, that the younger that it was obvious for the younger generation. So it gives me hope. And I do think that it's not as easy to silence us, it's not as easy to attack us, that we have organized. I mean, that's the thing, is like we are also more than 20 years after 9/11 and 20 years into the war on terror. And of course, there's this feeling that there's been so much destruction, so much silencing. But now, actually, in the past 6 months, I realized that the work that we've been doing, that many of us have been doing, is actually coming to fruition, because people had tools, had a narrative, a vocabulary, right, to talk about Palestine and Gaza. And also, honestly, I really feel in the US in particular, like I feel it in the streets when I'm in a protest and I see, and I'm surrounded with young people, that the terminologies and repertoire of indigenous people and Black people with the Black Lives Matter uprising has really converged in this movement. I mean, of course, it's a matter of Palestinians themselves, activists and groups, being able, and that's something that is very inspiring for me. Like this slogan, for example, Palestine is a feminist issue, did not like come all of a sudden. It was actually built through decades of activism and decades of engagement with feminist groups. So I do feel that certain things have moved, and I'm trying to kind of focus my attention on the things that have moved. So yeah, I think that there's some positive despite everything. So let me tackle an aspect of your question. This is very important, and I hope I've expressed it well. Or it's very important to really get out of this reactionary decolonizing. It's super important because when you really, and I also noticed, and maybe that's a judgment, but it's okay. I think that's part of our job to judge. I do notice that I see a certain form of decolonizing among people who have very little connection to the region, who really theorize from the empire and always kind of address the empire. It's all about the US and it's all about the empire. And I feel that many of us who actually have lived in the region, who engage, who have a deep engagement in the region, we know that actually, I mean, when I talk about Thawrat Tashrin, I mean, we know that the protesters really insisted on the killing of the armed groups that are supported by Iran, that of course they denounce, US imperialism, but equally they denounce the post-2003 regime and the influence of regional actors. And that actually I have really, really strongly criticized a lot of post-colonial feminist theory that was stuck in this response to the empire. And really overlooking, and that's a form of epistemic violence, to overlook the regional, the everyday violence that of course are structurally tied to empire, but not, the enemy is like in front of your face, right? The enemy, the enemy is the administrator that doesn't take your paperwork if you don't pay them. It is the head of an armed group that is going to kidnap you if you say anything about the post-2003 political class. It's Iraqis who are torturing activists killing journalists. It's not people from the moon, right? So, and I think this is really, really important. And that's really, in 2003, we had this thing about people being anti-war and like promoting Saddam. And I'm like, we have to be careful with this because this is part of the problem, and that it is not undermining. We have to be able to be complex. We have to be able, and this is why I emphasize so much on the structures and the infrastructures, but I also talk about like the ways in which as individuals we play a role within these infrastructures and structures. And I think that it is really essential that we do not reproduce certain tropes that actually belong to another era and another world and don't make sense at all. And actually, every time I see scholars having this kind of very reactionary decolonial discourse, I kind of guess that these people are not very involved with the everyday life of the places that they are talking about. Because also, this is not the way people, for example, in Iraq actually, it's not a term that people use. It's not the way people actually articulate and make sense, right? And this is why I think it's important to always be careful and listen. And even if we hear things that don't fit our categories, I mean, one of my kind of methodology is to always, as a scholar this time, let the categories emerge as opposed to come with like predefine and like impose it on a context and be like, oh, it's all about patriarchy and colonialism. No. This is not the kind of research that, this is not honoring, this is not respectful. And in some way, I feel it's like, it's a form of racism in the sense that it's simplifying, homogenizing, etc. And sometimes also the centrality, I mean, I talk about the US a lot because I live in the US and because it is important at certain moment, but I do think that we need to also decenter that not everything is about the US in our region. It's very important to say. So now, how do I negotiate? Yeah, I mean, the negotiation between, sometimes I wish, I don't know what it is to actually be a scholar and work on something that is not deeply personal. I have never tried. Maybe one day I will. Maybe one day I will work on something that has nothing to do with me and I'll see. And it's true that the emotions that we deal with when we talk about, our homes, our people, it's a challenge. It is a challenge. It slows us down very often. It slows us down. I've seen people actually, I remember, a while ago when I was a graduate student, there was a person who was writing a paper. We were writing a paper on the same topic, and which is feminism in Iraq. And I've noticed how quick this person who was a young white person, very well-intentioned, but I also noticed the fact that she was so quick in the sophistication of the theory and so good in like the analysis and pointing out. And because I felt that it's also because she didn't have the emotions, that things were like up there, right? In the world of abstraction, she was so good with it. And I was not as good as her because I was always slowed down by my emotions in how I, that's one aspect, right? But concrete aspect is, but at the same time, and I think that's important also is that, and again, it's really against like reactionarism, is that we work from a place of love, whatever we work on, right? As opposed to a place of like against and I mean, rage is a good thing. I have nothing against rage. I mean, really, it's a fuel. But I do feel that in my personal life, navigating in this academic world, and I am lucky to have a tenured position. I feel very privileged, and I'm trying to actually acknowledge these privileges and try to redistribute these privileges or use my position here to be able to actually find resources for people who have less privilege. But I do think that what has sustained me is to work from a place of love, of true love for my people, for I mean, my country, my family, the women that I work with, and that it sustains you longer than actually doing things from a place of hatred or anger or being against, right? Maybe it's not a very kind of academically correct way of answering your question, but I think that, yeah, we are tied to our emotions, and emotions are real, and they define our life, how we see the world, and the kind of career choices that we make. And, you know, sometimes it's good to be strategic, you know, not post something, post it in a different way. It's important to be strategic because there's also like a value in self-preservation. And it's always the question, like, is this going to really change things in Gaza if I post this? Like, or is it just me trying to deal with my survival's guilt, right? So that is work that we need to do on ourselves, really. And I'm not saying that while not acknowledging kind of the structural problems and the difficulty of existing in the academic world, that is still a very masculine, it's still a very, it's still a man's world, right? A white man's world. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop here.
Sure, okay. So, tour time is 7:20.
Oh, wow.
7:35. 7:35, okay. Yeah. So we have more time. You're not fast. Well, we don't want to start eating and then have the people who are fasting not get any food. So we got to kind of time this in a way that works for everybody. We can take, why don't we take 2 more questions, and then we can figure out where we are there. Alyssa and anyone, and Vida, okay. Max too, is that your hand up?
Max, go. Yeah, you go first.
Alyssa, please go ahead.
When you're studying, I know you're Iraqi, so I'm sure a lot of the times when you like interview people, let's say, probably what they say might resonate with you, but is there ever times, and I don't know if you have like a specific instance when something maybe doesn't resonate with you, or it seems like contradictory to what you believe, or you learn something new perhaps, and then how do you like go about that? Because sometimes, you know, the reason why you know something or think you know something is because of your experience. But then if you try to like research it to find out, well, are they right? Am I right? And there's not maybe a lot of research on that. How do you like navigate that, I guess?
Thank you so much, Zahra. I was thinking about this question of value, because, you know, we're in this interesting space here in the school, like we're in this School of International Affairs, where it's less sort of traditionally academic, right? And so there's a lot of discussion all the time about it. Is this really valuable? Is this practically valuable, what you're doing here? But I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about the fact that research is always to a degree an extractive process, like it's a process of objectification, just by nature of the kind of processes that we use. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, so you were talking about kind of like being in conversation with the folks that you're doing research with, being partners with them, right? Having them set the agenda. And, you know, some of us are from the places that we're studying, some of us aren't. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, like an example, like how you see that, like what are the tools or mechanisms that you think are essential to getting at the kind of value you're talking about? Because the kind of value we often hear about here is very much about, you know, international development policy, or it's sort of thinking about what's practical for these institutions that are engaged in the region. And sometimes that is also about, you know, localizing that and so.
Max has a question too.
Yeah, so I was fascinated by, first of all, thank you for speaking with us. It was a wonderful presentation. I think, like Shifa said too, you have a very beautiful way of speaking, like not only in the topic that you're discussing, but also just how you are addressing all of us. I was interested by what you were saying about language, and the first part of my question is, I think now that languages that were colonially imposed, like English and French, are so widely spoken by large swaths of populations in these formerly colonized countries, do you think there's a process that like these languages, now that the majority of their speakers are maybe not in the global north, that these languages could be decolonized? Yeah. And then I guess the second part of that question is in terms of publishing more material or having like journals that are in languages that aren't traditionally the languages of academia, like what are I guess some of the main practical ways to make that happen, and also things that you hope that academia would gain from doing that?
I want to add a question / thing to think about. So I'm aware that there's like 5 people who are about to write their theses. That are in a research design and methods class, and they're going to go do their thesis research over the summer. And I also recognize how kind of paralyzing these kinds of conversations that we're having today can be about sort of, oh, I'm going to go do this thing. And so I just wondered some of the ways that I think about it. Very briefly, I once did a grant application for a summer grant here at Georgetown, and I said, I want to go do this research. I don't have a research, I don't have a hypothesis. What I have is I'm going to go do this research and I'm going to see what comes out of it. I'm going to listen to what happens and I'm going to then write a paper about it. And they were like, you can't do that. That's not research. And so I think one of the things that you kind of have to think about, this is my attempt to sort of lift the paralysis that may have settled on some of us, is to say, I got to play this game. Right? I got to get my research through the institutional review board. I've got to say these things. I've got to say, I'm going to do this and it's going to show me this and I'm going to do that. And then you go out in the field and you go, and now I'm going to listen to Zahra and I'm going to listen to people, right? And I'm not going to come with I'm going to put those categories that I created on the side, and I'm going to actually now engage in research in a way that I find ethical, in the way that I think is the right, so that you can do these two things together. Sometimes just the form you have to put in front of the institutions is different than the way you conduct it. And maybe you could comment on that if you think that that's right.
Yeah, no, I like the notion of play the game. It's really yes, exactly. It's what it is. I mean, we all have personal goals. We want to do things and achieve things, and sometimes we got to play the game. So how do we accommodate, our navigation in this very unjust world, with self-preservation, also preserving ourselves, our career, but at the same time staying, ethical. Although the term ethical is, we need to politicize this term, but also to stick to our deep and core values of doing something meaningful, right? It's not easy at all. As I was saying, in the critical studies of Iraq, I'm trying to do 2 things that are kind of contradictory. And this is why I said I love this definition of decolonizing as you are kind of entering, but you're planning your escape. Because we live in this world, right? And we need to, it's also important that people who have high standard of ethics and good politics actually get good jobs and are in places of responsibilities. It's super, super important. And I think that, so for example, I'm trying at the same time to get these junior scholars the visibility that they want in this very unequal and unfair global academy. So in many ways, I'm kind of helping them to reproduce white masculine hegemonic rationality, right? But I think that there is something, so and on the other hand, I'm trying to foster a knowledge making that is different, that's saying something different, and also initiate spaces where this knowledge can be considered as knowledge. So it's kind of 2 contradictory things, but I think that what's important is to be aware of what you are doing, is to understand that you are, and I love this term, playing a game, right? This is a game, and I'm aware there are rules to this game, and I'm aware that I have to play by the rules in the limit of this game. And that doesn't mean that, I believe fully in or that I agree with all these rules. And I think life is about negotiation. Life is never about, I mean, it's really reactionary to think that, and I think detrimental to think that we could like break everything and start everything from scratch. We have to make our way up and constantly negotiate. We are constantly, especially us in this room. I mean, whoever got a visa to come here, or whoever got a green card, or whoever got the citizenship, we know that we are talking from a place of a certain level of privilege, right? And this is also why it's important for me to really, at the same time, promote identity politics and show that actually it can really be a radical project, but also problematize it in the sense that, you know, it will live in a world that is structured by systems of power, and there are moments and places that we occupy where we actually are, we benefit from these systems of power. And there are moments and places and in doing certain things that we actually question them or we are oppressed by them. And so, of course, it is about negotiating our position within these spaces of power. But gaining more power is also what we want, right? Is also what we want. And it takes time, and everything is kind of a process. And actually, I don't know if I'm really answering all the questions, but actually the language, for example, question is a good example. Also, to go back to your point is, so if I was kind of arguing that you need to like publish in Arabic, and, you know, I do think that there is a specificity to debates that happen in Arabic. There's a scholarship out there, there's debates, there are theoretical frames that exist within the language, and the language is a world, is an imaginary, is tied to people, a certain view of the world. However, first of all, it's not, I mean, it is, we have to also acknowledge that Arabic is a very problematic language. I mean, it's also a hegemonic language, right? So what about Kurdish? When we, especially when we speak about Iraq, what about Kurdish? What about Turkmen? What about, so the fact that, and this is when my own limitation, so the critical studies of Iraq is a project that, I mean, I'm only basically involving scholars who are like in Arab speaking Iraq. I'm not Kurdish, I don't speak Kurdish. And even there's a chapter in my book where I talk about the fact that when I actually go to Kurdistan, I realize like, I'm not necessarily the best person to conduct this research. Like, so it's also problematizing, and there's nothing like better about my positionality. I think it's more about the transparency, the honesty in which I encounter my interviewees, the people I work with, and how I am not blind to the power relations that exist. It is really about this transparency, this honesty. So yeah, I'm doing this. It's a little bit problematic. I know it's problematic, and I should continue seeing how it is problematic, but I gotta play the game, and I gotta advance my career. I have to do such and such, right? But I do think that there are ways, I mean, as scholars, and I do think things are changing. I mean, this decolonial turn is really changing a lot of things in academia. And I feel that there's certain trajectory, I mean, there's certain things that we can also tell our students kind of early on. Like, maybe you should not waste your time. I mean, the same way that I'm very inspired by the ways in which in Black studies, I mean, people are very, if you see a panel about the Black experience, you will see Black people talking about the Black experience. And if anybody actually claim that they can do that and they are not Black, you will see an outrage, you will see a reaction. So why is that when it comes to the Middle East, it's never the case? Why is that? It's never the case. Why do we tolerate so much people who don't speak the language, who barely even been in the region? I mean, when it comes to Iraq, I know people who have been only in the green zone who wrote books about Iraq, right? So yeah, I mean, it's all about being aware and also renewing our understanding of these power structures. They change, they move, and we also move, right? Our positionality evolve also throughout our lifetime, right? And I do think that it's important to keep being aware of the relational in in how we build our identity, in how we see ourselves, in how we, I think it's also, we have to let kind of the unpredictable happen, not always impose kind of preconceived ideas. Oh, I cannot do that because I'm not the right person. You don't know, maybe you're going to write a wonderful paper, maybe it's a policy paper, but it's going to be useful and it will have a good impact, right? It's really important not to be dogmatic and to stay relational, to also let life happen at the same time, but still always be aware of the power dynamics and be really careful and renew our understanding of what is good and what is bad and who is powerful and who is less powerful. But to also have a complex analysis of power, not a simplistic one.
Did that get all the questions and everything?
I think so.
Yes, we all good. Okay, please thank